5, 6, 7, 8.
Welcome to the EX podcast, where I talk with business leaders, authors, and disruptors on how the workplace is changing. The podcast brings a different lens to the conversation around HR transformation, company culture, and employee engagement. It offers a brand and customer experience perspective rather than a traditional HR perspective. Why? Because companies have to think of themselves as employment brands if they hope to attract and retain talent. It is time we put people first to rehumanize the workplace. Simply because leaders who don't care about their employees will eventually be surrounded by people who don't care about their business. Today's guest is Jason Ashlock, Senior Vice President of Customer and Employee Experience at Kuehne Nagel. Today, with Jason, we talk about his unique role overseeing both CX and EX and how EX and CX are intertwined. We also talk about the differences between EX and CX and if there is one that comes first before the other. Jason walks us through Kuehne Nagel's journey of implementing both EX and CX, and he shares how he sees talent and customer acquisition evolve, as well as the HR function in the next 5 years. Support for this podcast is brought to you by Life Guides. Life Guides helps companies increase employee engagement and reduce presenteeism loss by providing a human-to-human network to help employees through their life challenges. Life Guides pairs people who are going through a specific life challenge with guides who have gone through the exact same life challenge. As Match.com pairs people for love and DoctorsOnDemand.com finds doctors for patients, Life Guides matches a guide to each employee's specific life challenge. For employers, Life Guides offers a range of customized plans which support your employee families with one-on-one support, offers empathy and experienced guidance, and are highly affordable. Find out more at www.lifeguides.com. I hope you enjoyed this conversation with Jason. Because it takes a good amount of time to produce this podcast, please make sure to review the podcast on iTunes, Google Play, Stitcher, TuneIn, or YouTube, as it will help promote the content. If you want me to speak at your next event, get some advice on your EX initiatives, or send me feedback and suggestions for future topics or guests, you can reach me at svincent@exsummits.com or on Twitter at ex_summits. All right, let's get to it. Hi, everyone. Welcome to another episode of the EX podcast. Very excited for today's guest, Jason Ashlock. Jason is calling from the New York City area, and he's the Senior Vice President of Customer and Employee Experience at Kuehne Nagel. Jason, thanks for joining us today.
Thanks for having me. Glad to be here.
For those who are not familiar, and I don't think there are many of our listeners who are familiar with Kuehne Nagel, but what does the company do exactly?
Yeah, certainly. I would not be surprised if for many of your listeners it's the first time that they've heard the name of this company. And I have to congratulate you on pronouncing it so well. Your European roots are serving you well. Kuehne Nagel, it's a 130-year-old logistics and supply chain and freight forwarding company. Started in Bremen, Germany in 1890. Obviously, last couple of dozen years for us have been an innovative time, but at the root of what we do is still basic freight forwarding. Fundamentally, producers all over the globe need to get product from A to B, and we are the facilitators of that transport. We don't own the boats or the ships, we don't own the planes or the trains, but we facilitate all of the complexity and the mechanics that are involved in getting goods cross-border, cross oceans, or just cross regions and geographies. We have 90,000 employees almost in about 1,400 locations globally, active in 110 countries, and located just outside Zurich, Switzerland.
What is your background and how did you get to KNA?
KNN, yeah. So one of the wonderful things about working in the EX space right now is that almost nobody was born for it, meaning nobody had a pathway to where we landed. We discovered this domain and discipline and field of study and activity through a variety of different pivots of our own. So I certainly don't have a background in supply chain and freight forwarding. I wouldn't have suggested to you at any point in the previous acts of my professional career that I would be working at a company like this doing this. But everybody's journey, whatever kind of undulations or circularity is involved, when you look back on it, you can see a red thread. So I'll briefly give you my red thread. Mm-hmm. The first act of my career within academia, I did graduate work in religious history of religious thought, and religious societies. And then I did graduate work in American literature, the study of how narrative shapes national identity. And then I left academia and went into intellectual property management, where for 5 years I had started and managed a company here in Manhattan that packaged and sold intellectual property to book publishers and magazine publishers, television producers, film studios, et cetera, with a real focus on business thought leadership, which eventually kind of migrated into organizational psychology and organizational development, innovation, et cetera. And after selling a couple hundred books and working closely with researchers and thought leaders, I sold that company and invested in a consulting practice that took a lot of those ideas and applied them to big enterprise, to big Fortune 500, Fortune 1000 context. And basically, this gets you to your red thread. The experiment that I was running was, could you take the basic principles of publishing and media, the idea of packaging a story that matters in a container or some kind of component unit that was accessible to your readers or your audience, use existing distribution channels or new distribution channels to get that content to them, and then to engage them in kind of community building and in the ongoing exercises of audience development. That's what media and publishing companies try to do, whatever the intellectual property is. If you apply that to enterprise, it gets really interesting. It opens up a whole new set of questions inside big business that we've been asking in different ways, maybe without the right language and tools to do so. For instance, what if you looked at your employees like an audience, like a marketplace, the same way a commercial publisher would look at an audience that they're trying to reach with a book or a media product? And what if you tried to engage them and distribute to them using mechanisms that would make sense in a commercialized environment? What if you engage them on the front end and the back end of that content, unique community and audience building ways that created a co-creative context where your audience was also producing something with you, exploring and applying that content publicly? In other words, what if all of the problems we have in organizations around communication and influence and buy-in, employee engagement, what if a lot of those could be, if not solved, at least addressed through the lens of effective publishing? So I did that for 5 years, selling solutions and developing unique ways of engaging employees in big enterprise global business. And so now you hear where I'm going with it. Doing that for a few years just gets you closer and closer to the idea of employee experience, and what it's like to work in companies that do or do not speak to you well and welcome you into your own journey and equip you along the way. And then, of course, with a consumer background, it only makes sense that you start asking these sets of questions across the customer experience and the employee experience simultaneously.
And you have a quite unique role overseeing both the customer and the employee experience at Kuehne Nagel. Can you explain to us how it works and how CX and EX are connected?
Yeah, happy to do so. And I have to tell you how fortunate I feel to have that title. I've spoken to so many leaders and so many businesses, either as a consultant or an intellectual property developer, or now, inside a global logistics firm. We talk to so many leaders who have been tasked with one of these domains or the other. And in almost every case, when I tell them that I get to ask questions across both domains, and I get to investigate solutions and test and iterate with customers and employees and co-create on engagement platforms across both directions, the response I usually get is, man, I wish we did that. And so, even though I think logistics and supply chain are maybe a little bit late to the party when it comes to really crafting customer journeys, and I don't know if we're late to the party, but certainly it's time for us to get serious about the employee journey. I'm glad that Kuehne Nagel is asking these questions in the same frame. And I feel really, really fortunate to be able to look at the intersections here. So let me give you a quick, really quick summary of kind of how we perceive these two things to be related. The fact that they've existed separately tells you a lot about how we have conceived big business. In other words, we have generally perceived our organizations as having an internal product development or value development chain that produces a product that then goes into a market and needs to find an audience. And that works pretty well in sort of, traditional markets or stable global dynamic. Doesn't work so well now. We need the people at the end of the chain, the end users, those who will buy this product, to be involved with us throughout the process of creating it, not just at the end, not a kind of build it or, create it and they'll buy it. And so by thinking about the customer experience as not the end result of what we do, but as an integral part of what we do, not thinking of a customer journey as a transactional journey, but thinking of the customer journey as a loop that circles back and back and back through our company through different ways to engage. And sometimes those ways of engaging are not just buying. They are also other ways to think of how stakeholders engage with the business. So once you start rethinking customer journeys as not being these linear paths that lead to a transaction and a sale, but actually these rather complex sort of three-dimensional looping models of interaction, then you begin to open up the idea that, okay, what we're really doing as a company is creating a context for community, creating a context for relationship. That's what we do. And it might be that most of the relationship moments that we have are about the delivery of a product or a service, and they might have transactional elements in common. But what we'll really do is trying to create a platform upon which relationships can be built in a stable way over time, delivering value incrementally to all players in that space. Once you start doing that, the employee has to become part of that human conversation. So you can't look at them as separate domains. You have to look at them as a continuum might be a better way of thinking of it in the sense that they're part of a set that can't be broken down. The definition of a continuum, you can't pull them apart. They're interacting. You can think of it through the human experience. So maybe we should stop talking CX and EX and start talking HX. Like, what is the human experience across? Maybe the company needs to serve the same role for employees that it does for customers. And that gets me to the sermon that I preach on a daily basis here, which is, what if employers looked at their employees as their customers who woke up every morning and decided whether or not to buy the company's product? And for an employee, the company's product is its culture, the experience of working here. And an employee buys that product with the only currency he or she has: their talent, their creativity, their time, their brains, their passion. And if you build a cultural product they want to buy, they will return and buy that product from you again and again. They will spend more and more. And if you build a product they don't want to buy, they'll spend less and less, and eventually they'll spend it somewhere else. And so consumerizing the employee experience and humanizing both employee and customer experiences gives you a kind of baseline framework for how we then begin to pursue excellence in both.
What are the differences between EX and CX? We talked about some of the similarities and how they're all very deeply connected. What are some of the differences when people are considering focusing on EX? And they've been hopefully working on the CX for quite some time, but they're looking at applying some of the things that they've done on the employee side.
Well, I argue every day and continue to promote the idea that they should have far more in common than they have not in common. So I'm used to making a counter argument. So this is an interesting thought experiment for me, Stefan. Thank you for the challenge. I would say, let's start with the basics. One of the fundamentals is that your employees, whether they're sitting in your office or working remotely, are in a constant state of experience with you. From the moment that they wire in at the beginning of the day or swipe their badge at the edge of the warehouse or whatever, they are in your space. Everything they touch and feel and sense and experience is part of their conception of the company. And so thinking of employee journeys or employee touch points is really complicated, because the touch point is literally the chair you chose to buy for that desk, or whether or not that desk can stand or not, or whether or not they have access to natural light. And it has to do with, their benefits sign up every November in open enrollment. And it has to do with, their sense of belonging to their team and their sense of being skilled enough to do the job well. And so there are ways of thinking of touch points or, quote unquote moments that matter in the employee experience. Mm-hmm. But because it is so total, it is so holistic, for most employees, the organization is what we might term the total institution, in that old psychological term for an all-encompassing domain that basically dominates the thinking of one's life. And so that is very different than a customer experience, in which the customer's experience with an organization of any kind is need-based. It's driven by, a use case or a scenario in which they're trying to get a job done, and they need a product or a service to help them accomplish that goal. So, we talk very realistically about this here. Our customers are product agnostic. They don't care what the complexities of supply chain management or logistics. Most of them don't, right? Certainly the bigger companies that have huge supply chain divisions do. But most of our small to medium size, or even a lot of our large companies, they don't really want to know about all the nuts and bolts. They just need to get one thing from one place to another place. And so they want as few touch points as possible. They want to engage as little as possible. They want zero friction. They want seamlessness. They want transparency and real-time access to anything they need. They want self-serve dynamics. They don't want a total institution. They want discrete moments in time where you are valuable to them. Mm-hmm. And there might be, a partnership and a relational dynamic. Certainly that's what we try to create. But it's much easier to journey map on the customer side, even if there's an intense complexity around how customers discover you, or intense complexity around sort of elements of the process that can or cannot be optimized and automated and things. But the journey itself with the key touch points is much more easy to delineate. Whereas with the employee experience, it is this universe of touch points that are extremely, I think, more challenging to tease out. So I would put that forward as one fundamental difference and challenge to be looking at these two things at the same time.
What comes first then? Is there one that should come before the other?
It's a question that we have grappled with in a couple of really helpful ways here. And I hear your question. I think it's a good one, but I want to challenge the premise. And the premise is that there should be some kind of linearity to the approach. And I think we're really talking about simultaneity more than we're talking about linearity. And I'll put it this way for you. When you look at what motivates an employee, and you can take any number of research papers and ongoing theories of human motivation, but let's steal one that's really popular. Let's take Daniel Pink's simple, reductive, always reductive, but good, but helpful formula for employee engagement and motivation: autonomy, mastery, and purpose. Right? Those are his big three. We use those a lot here because you can get a handle on all of them, and there's a lot of work to be done in each domain. So autonomy, of course, would be like decision power. So do I, as an employee, have the independence to solve my problems, access to the things I need to do to work independently? Do I feel like I'm respected and trusted enough to do the things for my team or my customer or in my software system that I need to do to make progress every day? Mastery would be, am I getting smarter? Am I growing? Am I having access to opportunities to better myself, professionally and within the technical skills domain that I'm in, but also maybe within the softer dynamics of what it means to be a team player and a leader. And then purpose is, what am I here for? Do I feel like every day I wake up and I step into a working environment where I meaningfully contribute to some other human's progress in the world, that I can look back and say I contributed, I made something that somewhere around me is definitive proof I existed, right? I made a difference. And it's in that last one, that purpose one, where I feel like without having a strong CX emphasis, without thinking and driving your people to ask, what are you doing for the customer? It's really hard to drive purpose.
Yes.
Purpose can be, it can be abstraction around we as a company stand for Patagonia. Let's take Patagonia, for instance, a very purpose-driven company. Everybody who goes there knows they work for a company that cares about equality, that cares about the environment. But you could do anything and care about the environment. You could work at any company for that. What is it unique about Patagonia? You have to have something in there that is, I believe in our product. I believe that this fleece I sell, has some meaning in someone's life. I believe this kayak that we sell has some, significant contribution to make to a family or a person. You got to believe in what you're selling and what you're doing, and that involves a customer. So only exclusively focusing on EX creates a really insular, internalized, navel-gazing kind of, let's make this the coolest, sexiest, best place to work, But if that's not pointed towards something or someone or some external value creation,
yes,
it becomes hollow. And I think you see that in a lot of the organizations that are driven by really promoting this amazing place to work. But you don't necessarily always hear a lot about how the mission gets lived out in the really practical, tactical, boring stuff of every day. And that's where the CX stuff matters. So it's not about doing one before the other. I think it's about starting with the same sets of questions about both. What purpose do we serve in the life of this person? What job are we helping them get done? What progress did we enable them to achieve today? And what tools and processes and approaches do we need to make that happen more regularly? And then looking for the places where they overlap. I'll tell you, one of the tools, you and I talked a little bit about the toolkit that we use here that we built from scratch a couple of years ago. But one of the tools we use is a simple guided process by which every single one of our employees, whether they're customer facing or not, engages 2 times a month in a guided process of talking to a customer on the phone. Not about transactions, not about operations or delivery, not about business, but about what's it like to work with us and how do they feel about the dynamic and how's their business, what are they trying to get done? Really open, honest, generous questions. And our employees who engage in that walk away from those calls with a higher level of motivation than we have ever achieved in any internal program. And it's because we're connecting those people with the purpose of what they do and with the fact that another human being is harmed or helped by what we choose to do every day. And so I think we can look at it several ways, but that's where I would begin, and I would argue for simultaneity.
Can you walk us through your company's journey of implementing both EX and CX? And some of the things,
Yeah.
I mean, where do you start?
Yeah, absolutely. And I'm also conscious, Stefan, that you and I love this topic and can talk about it all day. So I lean on you to make sure you pull me back to reality and we don't get too abstract here.
Sure.
So thanks for this question. So we began this particular part of our journey. I won't go back farther than is my line of sight. So I think this organization has been on this journey to come to this place for a very long time, well beyond my time here. But I began as a consultant for Kuehne Nagel in 2015, asking a very baseline set of questions around, were customers experiencing us to a level that they should when they looked at the marketplace for freight forwarders and logistics partners? Were we, in fact, offering a distinctive experience that across our customer population, which is incredibly vast, right? Tens of thousands of customers of all different types and kinds, B2B, interacting with us, whether also across all our product lines, right? So sea freight, do you ship by sea carrier? Or do you go by air freight? Or do you use road and rail and overland? Or do you need customs brokerage? Or do you need multimodal and intermodal? And, from the world in terms of trade lanes and the complexity of tariffs. We have customers of all types doing so many things, not to even mention, I didn't even mention warehousing, contract logistics, and all the inventory complexity that goes with that. So it's a huge box to open up. Mm-hmm. But we opened it up by starting with one customer segment where we felt like the customer experience would be really visible, whether it was good or bad, and that's with the small to medium-sized customers. Key accounts are going to get a lot of attention. Big customers are going to have dedicated teams. And whereas we can always grow in that way, we felt like, we're best in class in our industry in that space. What we wanted to ask is, what's it like for a small company to come knock on the door of a 130-year-old, 1,400 location, 90,000 employee company and say, can you help me? Did we pay enough attention to those little knocks on the door? Did we attend to their needs? Did we have systems set up to know them as well as we should and to help them as well as we should? It doesn't make sense to have white glove attention maybe on a bunch of small customers the same way you would on a massive account in aerospace or pharma. But how could we simulate some of those same scenarios? And the reason why I bring this up is because concretely that, we could have asked the questions across any set of customers, but we went to a place where we felt like the honesty would be unavoidable. Like we couldn't hide behind any of our current practices. We couldn't make an excuse or an argument about our behavior. We would go to a place where we knew it's the toughest place to provide great customer experience and ask ourselves, how are we doing? And so that was the starting place. And once we started pulling back the layers around that experience, we started uncovering the drivers of our poor or high levels of excellence. So when we got it right, what did it look like? And when we got it wrong, what did it look like? And that led us to this place of talking about the employee experience. In other words, what we found is the instances or locations or teams or leaders or products where we were able to achieve a really high level of customer engagement and satisfaction. Those environments were defined by certain cultural norms, by certain agreed upon behaviors, by certain levels of environment and leadership dynamics. And with those in mind, we then began to explore how to scale those and how to grow those. So you can go back to your question you asked a moment ago. Is this CX or is this EX? And while it's a helpful question, I don't know that it's necessarily the right distinction, because it's both. The question that drives us is, how do we make a difference in the world? Because that's what we do for our customers, right? We make or break their businesses. We support them in their growth and success. We oftentimes shape them into the global players they become merely by what we're able to accomplish for them. But then how do we do that well? That gets down to how we agree to work together in the back end. So it's pointed towards the customer experience, but it's grounded in the day-to-day employee activity. So what we then, led to another set of questions, which is, what inside the employee environment are the right nudges or the right triggers to enable good service action, cooperation across departments to solve customer problems, transparency and trust, so that we are all kind of working towards the same goal? What do we got to do to get there? And so to that, we applied the field that I had worked a lot in when I was in intellectual property and when I was in organizational consulting, and that's behavioral economics. And Stefan, that's what you and I got to talk about a couple of weeks ago in that fantastic event you managed in Brooklyn on the employee experience. We talked about behavioral economics. Mm-hmm. And I can give you a lot of examples of this, but the one anecdote that I feel like is the easiest is this. During World War II, the U.S. military was plagued by a series of accidents in which really high-skilled pilots would successfully complete their missions. But then when they came to land the planes, they would unexplainably retract their wheels and they would crash the plane. And no one could figure out why this was happening, because the pilots were some of the best trained. They had invested, incredible amounts of hours and technical training to get them to this optimal state. They were flying their missions to an incredible degree of success. So these were the brightest in the population, and yet they were having this recurring across individuals crashing of planes at the conclusion of the mission. So whose fault is this? Was it the pilots? Were they sloppy? Were they lazy? Were they tired? Were the missions too long? Had they forgotten their training? Was there something flawed about the way they had been delivered the training? Well, it turned out upon discovery that in the cockpit, the lever for the wheels looked and felt almost exactly like the lever for the flaps. So when you're landing, in which a lot of things are happening simultaneously, the pilots, it was very simple. The pilots were simply pulling the wrong lever. Mm. When the military changed the levers so they could be differentiated by touch and color, lo and behold, the crashes stopped. This is a really good example of behavioral economics at work. When our people fail to deliver high service quality, when our people fail to use the system incorrectly, or to use it correctly, whether, data management or whatever, when our people fail to work well across channels or across departments, whose fault is this? Does anybody wake up in the morning and say, I'm going to cause a problem, I'm going to do badly by the client, I'm going to get lazy with data quality, or I'm going to have a friction or a toxicity with my colleagues? Of course not. We all wake up saying we want to fly the plane and land the plane well. But oftentimes, the system structures and settings inside our institutional environments are not optimized for us to do that. So the metaphor I use a lot internally is, we as the leaders of an organization have to be careful about how we design the cockpit. We have to give people really clear nudges and guidance around how to use the tools they're given at the right time and in the right way. And so to do that, we can't just rely on people's goodwill or people's good intention. We have to give them tools, nudges, tricks, hacks, etc., that enable them to be the best versions of themselves that they want to be. So we started experimenting in 2016 and 2017 around what were the environmental, interpersonal, inter-team nudges that could be placed inside an employee environment that would trigger them to be more collaborative, to be more reflective, to engage more in learning, to engage more in service actions and attitude, and to build higher degrees of social connection. Those were our priorities. And so we built this toolkit of 25 tools, and we tested all around the world. And we gathered data and feedback on whether or not it moved the needle on the key things we cared about. And then we began to scale the tools that worked the best. And so now we're in year 2 of our introduction of these behavioral tools that we believe stimulate the best in employee engagement. And we're watching now and seeing the results in terms of NPS score, customer satisfaction, customer retention, data quality, et cetera, et cetera. Every loop of learning, we optimize the tools further and grow them and develop them to make sure we're getting the most out of them. That is a kind of description of how we've gone at it. And of course, we've got a long runway ahead of us to get even better and better. But we now at least have established bedrock where within the organization, we're all talking the same language. We're all using the same tools. We're all committing to the same basic principles and journey. And now we're beginning to see after a year and a half or 2 years that the downstream lagging indicators are telling us that we got a lot of it right.
One of the big questions from leaders in organizations is around the implementation of the employee experience. As you mentioned earlier, it is, if it doesn't drive business performance, if it doesn't create value for the organization, it's hollow. What are some of the KPIs and metrics that you've put in place to actually track and measure the effectiveness of both CX and EX strategies?
Yeah, great question. The measurement, the metrics part of this equation, it still has a lot to be figured out about it. I think across the board, when you see people beginning to engage in this conversation, I would say one thing we've been very successful at internally is effectively separating the conversation from lagging indicators to leading indicators, and effectively separating qualitative and quantitative. And if you look at those two vectors, give me an example of a leading indicator, like put them on two axes if you want, right? Like build your standard quadrant. Give me a leading indicator that's qualitative. So that would be our ongoing employee listening tools, some of which are surveys, some of which are focus groups, some of which are our CEO breakfasts, et cetera, where we're really getting down to the core of the human experience in the organization, gathering how people feel about what it's like to work here, what the level of trust is in their team, their sense of belonging, their sense of engagement and customer value creation, et cetera. And so that's a qualitative, it's individual expressed feedback. And you can very early in the stages of our rolling out our program, you can very early see positive movement in that way. But then run to the total other side of the quadrant and ask, what's a lagging indicator that's qualitative? Well, for us, these are pretty straightforward. Are we keeping more of our talent? There's a lot of factors that go into whether or not someone chooses to continue to work for you. I told you earlier about our frame. We try to imagine our employees as customers who choose every day whether or not to buy our culture with their talent. So what prevents a person from continuing to spend with you and going to spend their talent in another organization? There's a lot of factors. You can't boil it down to, whether or not you have a good employee engagement program. But as the efforts that we instill in the company begin to touch upon system structure and begin to shift, how we assess people, how we incentivize, how we form teams, how we promote, how we develop individual career paths. We just launched a new platform last week internally that enables people to see their potential career path based on what skills they've got, what trainings they've taken, what their ambitions and objectives are. The more that the structures and settings in the company start reorienting themselves, start reshaping themselves around the core premise and value of the employee experience, you can begin then to see over time that your rate of retaining your key talent should go up. So we measure things like, the marketplace might call this unwanted employee attrition. Basically, it's just, did you keep the people you wanted to keep? That's a lagging indicator, and it's qualitative. I told you we have 90,000 people around the world. Some of those work in warehouses, some work in branch locations, some are in field sales, driving a car every day, calling on customers. Very different environments. But across all of those, we know the top performers. We know the ones that have potential to be top performers. We know the ones that matter most to a team and a customer. And we want to keep those people. And with a company as large as this, then the data can begin to tell you a story over time. And so what we're finding now that we're 2 years into the journey is that the locations that have more fully invested in this approach to customer or employee engagement and who have been on the journey long enough see substantial rates of decrease when it comes to unwanted employee attrition. Of course, we also look on the customer side too. So we look at a net promoter score coming in through some of our customer survey methodologies. We look at customer retention measured across a couple of different models. And those tell us not in the long run we're getting it right. Whereas in the early run, whether it's qualitative or quantitative, those leading indicators are much more about activity, engagement, intention. And those are the hopeful indicators. But it takes you a long time. And this is the advice I give to a lot of people who ask me about this. It takes a long time to know whether or not your leading indicators are matched to your lagging indicators. And this is a mistake people make. I think they assume that just by naming them that they're correlated. But we could be looking at leading indicators that give us a hopeful forward trajectory, but then realize that in some of these locations or within some of these dynamics, we actually don't get the end result we wanted. So then we have to go back and question, are we measuring the right things early on?
Yeah. And
that endless loop of iteration and improvement, making sure that what you're looking for early is getting you where you want to go later. That's a discipline that's just a constant daily battle to fight to make sure that you're honest about what the data is telling you, but that you're also not falling prey to what I call the tyranny of the quantifiable, that not everything's measurable. You also have to look to the human expression and sentiment that's embedded in other ways of gaining intelligence around whether your employees and your customers are indeed satisfied with the product you're selling them.
How do you see talents and customer acquisition evolve?
So it's funny you asked me this question. I'm sitting in our office in Jersey City right now, looking out my office window. We just redesigned our offices to put all of the walled and doored offices inside the floor and leave all of the windows on the outside of the floor exposed to all of our employees. So no offices own any of the window space anymore. It's really cool. The opposite model that used to be a few years ago. This is, again, one of those intentional moves to increase the employee experience. So now every one of our employees here in the office can walk across our floor on the 20th floor of 10 Exchange Place, and they're looking out, as I am right now, over the beautiful Hudson River, straight across downtown Manhattan. You can see the Statue of Liberty out my right-hand side. Oh, wow. I mean, it's a premier, $1 million view, and every one of our employees has it every day. But the reason I bring it up is because I look out my office window and I'm looking at our team of 20 talent acquisition specialists. And their job every day right now, they're sitting down doing it and watching them, is to produce the material that attracts, to guide the process of candidates as they engage, and then to place those talents and those candidates in jobs where they can be successful personally and add to the company value. I look at them and I think of that statement by John Sculley from Apple that he said, basically what we ask of a talent that comes to join us is that we will give you a place to do the best work of your life if you will hitch yourself to our dream. I think he said leash, if you will leash yourself to our dream for just a little while. And that to some extent describes the way we approach talent acquisition here. We have become more and more purposeful about articulating the value for the talent, the promise that we make them when they come to join us. And of course, that promise has its technical, measurable, traditional elements like your salary and benefits package. But it's also around what's it going to be like to work here and what can you hope to achieve here? Like we ask questions like, what do you want to get out of the job? Like you're coming here, what do you want to learn? Because whereas we don't say it outright, we don't expect people to stay with us forever, right? I mean, if we have lifelong employees, that's wonderful. But on the other hand, the idea of an employee base that is constantly refreshed with new points of view, as people cycle in and out of the organization is something that will continue to be a strategic advantage to organizations who can manage that well. You can manage that kind of migration or that potential risk to short-term productivity by having talent leave or come in at different times. You can reap the benefits if you're able to inflect it. So I think our conversation around that has been different. Tactically speaking, we have created talent sourcing centers. So we have now centralized the idea of talent sourcing so we can professionalize it. So everybody who works in talent sourcing or talent acquisition for us it goes through a great professional path to become, an expert in this space. We call them experts, right? That's what they're called, the talent acquisition experts. And they're very good at helping a candidate explore his or her desires and making sure that they're matched with the right opportunity. We also then marry this with our internal promotion. So we're also doing talent acquisition internally, looking for the internal mobility that could be advantageous to us. So I think for us, we have just kind of acknowledged that the changing landscape requires us to think differently about the promises we make at the beginning. And especially in a tight labor market like many of our countries are in right now, it's important that we make that promise very clear, and then of course that we follow through on it. On the customer side, for freight forwarding, this is a really interesting question because obviously there are parts of the sales cycle that remain as stable as they were years ago. If anything, our big key accounts are more procurement driven than ever. And so the RFQ and the RFP process is really tightly managed. On the other side, though, and I think this is important to note, the relational component to the selling cycle, it might be hidden and it might have been marginalized by a very tightly controlled procurement process. But reputation, sustainability commitment, a commitment to the human experience in terms of people experience, these elements are more and more a part of the RFP consideration. So, and that has been, for me, an intense validation. I can't tell you names here, but we won 2 major accounts in the past 9 months, that we won, I believe, almost exclusively on the story that we could tell about our culture. Obviously, our teams did an incredible job setting up the argument that we could fulfill customer requirements to the degree of complexity they needed with their global scale, that we were going to be the best suited for that. And our software systems have been advanced, and our team, dynamics are great, and our global network, we optimize the hell out of it. But when you go in and say, we're going to do it better than anybody else, and you're looking at several global players who basically come in saying everything I just said, the thing you make the sale on is the values and the ethos and the commitment to the people experience and to the world that we function in. Our approach to this is superior. And that argument is increasingly taken into account, so much so that I see RFP rubrics now that very clearly state the ratings for us and our competitors when we're judged on these criteria. So, if anybody's out there who's working in a pretty tightly controlled procurement environment, do not underestimate the fact that these factors are increasingly on the table.
Where do you see the HR function in the next 3 to 5 years? Is it going to be drastically different from what it is today? Is it going to be a very slow evolution? What are your thoughts on this?
We have a lot of conversations here about how much HR's transformation mirrors operational transformation, meaning
yes,
if you look at anything that's happening on the operational side of things, you're looking at increasing speed of automation or digitalization, then automation, shared services are offshoring, the process mapping to tightly control anything that's predictable, and then export exception management or variability back to the human side of things. Basically anything that can be, if you can squeeze efficiency out of it by process mapping it and then putting it into a business process automation or eventually into some kind of mechanization or machine learning or AI, it's going that way. We're certainly playing around with a lot of that. Same thing's happening with HR. We look at the core roles that HR played in the past administratively. Many of those things are not necessary for humans to do any longer. So our teams have to step up their contribution to the business by adding value in new ways. And that involves getting much closer to the strategic conversation for the business. I'm proud to say that in Kuehne Nagel right now, as we go through significant organizational leveling up, like we are inflecting this organization considerably from an operational side, from a process management side, from a technology side. There are major transformational projects running now for the next 2 years that are going to change the game in terms of how we function with our customers and probably how logistics is perceived in the marketplace. That is happening. And I'm telling you, it has been amazing for me to see how much the business units have looked to HR and said, help us do this in a way that is not just about process improvement, but is also about people empowerment. Help us do this in a way that is not just about market mapping, but is about talent, thinking about the talent that's going to fit in these locations to do these jobs better than we've ever done them before. Help us when we think about leadership development and the skills that our leaders are going to need in the future in this new, hyper agile environment versus the past where predictability was more normative. Help us. And that posture of business units looking at HR and saying, you are the partner we need for this critical moment. That means HR has to win that position, and you win it not by checking boxes related to administrative work. Got to cover all those bases. Obviously, you do it not just on the legal management and side of things, which of course is important. You do it by bringing more intelligence about the market, bringing more intelligence about your people. So we've significantly invested in people analytics here so that we can tell the business units, here's what we know about our people. Here's what we know about our talent. In fact, here's what we can predict about our talent in the future. So getting into predictive analytics based on what we know and measure. And for that, the business units then open up considerably to the idea of HR not being in the box that it's lived in, but now being a fully spidered and integrated partner in the conversations that are going to shape the future success of the business.
It's quite amazing to see how open to change and innovation Kuehne Nagel is for a 130-year-old company. It's very encouraging for a lot of companies and organizations and leaders listening to us.
Tell me about it. Okay. So that's our soundbite, Stefan, from the entire thing. Like, that's it. Forget anything I said. That's the soundbite. That's your teaser, because that's true. Like there is no reason for our tightly cost-controlled, engineering-minded, process-addicted, siloed mentality organizations across the world. There's no reason for them to think we can't have this conversation. If we can have it, you can have it. If our organization can go through this conversation with our top leadership, two days ago, I told you, outside Zurich, in our company headquarters in Schindellegi, Switzerland, beautiful building atop a mountain an hour outside Zurich. I was sitting in the room with our entire management board, having basically this conversation. What's our culture? What promise are we making to our people? As leaders, who are we as we engage with the community that we inspire to work every day? I mean, these are fundamental bedrock questions, and we're having them. And if we can have them, do not point me to a legacy organization that can't. It's quite possible.
You travel a lot. If you were to pick one city, which one would be your favorite?
Oh, Stefan, you went personal right at the end. I didn't expect that. I don't know. By the way, we're starting up a corporate social responsibility program that's getting real traction here. So I'm really hoping that I can commit in the coming months to travel a lot less and manage my carbon footprint more responsibly. That's a big part of our company right now. It's focusing on how to reduce the impact we make on the world. And so this is, publicly pronouncing my commitment to figure out how to do that myself. We're going to do that as a company. But I do travel a lot. I'm gone most weeks to all global capitals and I've been to 103 of our locations globally.
Oh.
I'm gonna pick two places if that's okay, but they're quite different. I'm gonna pick Bogota, Colombia, for a couple of reasons. One is I find the Colombians to be the most passionate, earnest cheerleaders for their company, or for their culture, for their country, than anyone I've met around the world. Anywhere you meet a Colombian, they are able to articulate for you the attractiveness and the warmth and the specialness of their country. Really, I think better than any culture that I've engaged with. And when you go there, you feel that really intimately. So I'm going to pick Bogota, although everybody will tell me I should go to the shore, but I like the mountains. And then the second place I'm going to pick is a place that surprised me over the last couple of years, because my first visit there was basically the opposite of everything I just said. I'm going to pick Singapore, because Singapore is really sneaky. It pretends to be something it's not, meaning you visit there once or twice and you're like, this is cosmetic, this is socially engineered, this is Disneyland everywhere, there's something about this that doesn't ring true. But then once you get beneath the surface, it opens up into this extremely authentic place that's a mix of people who, have long histories there and an enormous rotating expat community. And I find it to be sort of endlessly fascinating in the little corners and pockets that open up to you if you get a couple people who are willing to dig beneath the surface.
Yeah, I've never been to Colombia, but I've been to Singapore a couple of times, and it's a true melting pot, and it's incredible how both, I would say, Asian and Western cultures really fit and merge together. And there are some differences here and there, but it's a very unique place in itself.
It is. And, as you said, on that gateway, it's that gateway position between Asia and the rest of the world, as well as intra-Asia trade. So much intra-Asia trade passes through Singapore that it really ends up touching, I don't know what the measurement would be, but I would guess it ends up touching like a very high measurable percentage of the world's goods, whether as component parts or finished products. So probably whatever you're staring at in your office right now, or whatever food you ate recently, there's probably a pretty good chance some of it came through Singapore.
What is your favorite word?
I'm going to go with current favorite word, not favorite word of all time. It will shift over time. Currently, I'm going to go with longing. And I'll tell you why. I've been reading this book by David White, which is called The Heart Aroused, Poetry and the Preservation of the Soul in Corporate America. David White is an Irish-American poet, philosopher, and he embedded himself in the corporate world for a long period of time. But he's a poet and a philosopher. And so he brings this incredible poetic mindset and lens through the analysis of how we work every day. And one of the things that he talks a great deal about is the sense of human longing that plays out in the workplace, whether we acknowledge it or not. And how whether or not we do acknowledge it and welcome it and pursue it really determines whether or not any of us achieve happiness at work, or whether or not we're able to create an environment where other people can too.
What is your least favorite word?
But. I try to discipline myself out of using it, because it is extremely rare that something someone else expresses really deserves such a negation. Which is what but is, right? It's an eraser, as Tim David would say, the author of Magic Words. It's a but eraser. Like, you say but, and it basically destroys anything that came before. And, you're European, so I say this with kindness, but, it is a strong European impulse to work through ideas through argumentation. And so you can be in a room full of a lot of Europeans, and you will be presenting an idea, and their first response is going to be but. Now,
I can relate to that.
Now you have to admit I'm right, Stephen. You have to admit I'm right. And so but what often happens is that what they say next actually winds its way to agreement with you. But to get started, they needed to put out there that they were going to counteract you, or that we were going to wrestle about this a little bit. And to some extent, that wrestling and critical kind of grappling is really good. Not to some extent, to a large extent. But the idea of but, when expressed so regularly and so consistently inside organizations, is that agreement feels hard to find. And so we promote as much as possible a yes and culture. Can I find anything in what you just said that I agree with and I can build upon, rather than negating the thing I disagree with? And in so doing, we move towards greater consensus and a sense of cooperation and collaboration than we would have even if we wrestled our way to the agreement in the end.
What is the way for our listeners to follow you and Kuehne and Nagel on social media?
Kuehne-Nagel.com. That's KUEHNE-NAGEL.com. Great place to begin, although it is a corporate website. So I would actually invite you to go to kncareers.com. That's KNCAREERS, kncareers.com, which is our candidate portal. You can also follow us on LinkedIn. We have something like 400,000 followers now on LinkedIn, getting really great traction there through our storytelling. We do have some other social accounts that are primarily meant for employee branding and candidate attraction, so you're welcome to follow us elsewhere. Me personally, I'm having my own sort of social media crisis, given that I believe Facebook is probably the most detrimental organization on the face of the planet right now. So I'm not very active on social media. I am on Twitter. I've been there kind of passively for several years. I have 7,000 followers. So I'm not sure why I haven't posted anything, but you can find me there. The best place to find me, though, is just drop me an email. I'm at jason.ashlock@kuehne-nagel.com. Stefan will make sure that's up and available on your website as well. And I love to talk about these topics and related topics with anybody who is passionate about them too. So Stefan, thanks for having me. Hope to hear from your listeners.
Likewise, any last word of wisdom or advice?
Try. There is no such thing as the way things are. There is only the way things have always been. Give it a shot.
Nice. I love it. Well, thank you, Jason. It's been a pleasure.
Thank you, Stefan. Pleasure for me. Take care.
Thanks for tuning in to the EX Podcast. If you want to learn more, visit our website at expodcast.com. If you want to find out more about our next conferences, go to exsummit.com. Finally, you can also find my manifesto on business to employee or B2E branding at b2ebranding.co. See you next week.